Good evening. My name is Eleni Glegas, and I am faculty and director of the Historic Preservation Program at the Boston Architectural College. The BAC has been recognized with distinction for its leadership role in educating an extraordinarily diverse student body to help bring about social equity through the designs of landscape, interior spaces, the design for human health, real estate, sustainable design, and historic preservation, and more. So I'd like to welcome you to the first event of our fall 2022 lecture series called Just Environments. This inaugural lecture takes place during our week-long intensive, a distinctive time set apart in the semester for students to commune with one another and commit time to their studies in their respective programs. I would also like to add that this lecture is supported in part by a generous grant from the Eastern Savings Bank. So I'd like to give a short introduction for our guest here, Lydia Lowe. Lydia Lowe is the executive director of the Chinatown Community Land Trust and has spent 35 years organizing for civil rights, worker rights, preservation of affordable housing, and community empowerment in Boston's Chinatown. Recently, she has initiated efforts to preserve Chinatown's 19th century brick row house as permanently affordable housing, to create row house protection area in the neighborhood zoning code, and to designate Chinatown as both a historic and cultural district. She has participated in more than a decade of community-based participatory research on traffic-related air pollution and health, and led the community-based Chinatown Master Plan 2020 to develop a vision of a healthy community in areas of housing, mobility, public realm, cultural and historic preservation, and environmental justice. Lydia serves on the Community Advisory Board of UMass Boston's Institute for Asian American Studies, the Friends of the Chinatown Library, and the Governor's Environmental Justice Council. So the BAC is very excited to bring Lydia here, who is someone who thinks about preservation and community expansively and the intersection of many of our disciplines in all of her work. So for those of you joining online, please write your questions in the chat below and mute your microphones at this time. And everyone, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Lydia Lowe as she presents her lecture, Justice at the Intersection of Preservation and Resilience.
Thank you. So I called this lecture Justice at the Intersection of Preservation and Resilience because I find that in my work at the Chinatown Community Land Trust, increasingly I'm working in different spaces, in different lanes around environmental justice, around historic preservation, around the arts and cultural placekeeping. But my background, I've spent more than 30 years as a community organizer, and I'm on the justice train. And it just goes through a lot of different lanes. So let me get the clicker, make sure I know how to use this. So recently, I was surprised to find that, oops. It's supposed to go. Am I supposed to point it at something? Should I just go here?
Yeah.
Yes. No, that's not working either. Okay, so recently I was surprised to find out that I was being recognized for my role in building awareness of historic preservation. And it made me think, is it preservation that I'm working on? Preservation, certainly there is something about Chinatown that we're trying to preserve. But it also, maybe it's my bias, preservation, you know, it calls up a kind of stereotype that calls to mind something static, as if we're trying to embalm our community, to keep them as intact specimens of a former life. And I'm thinking like Newport mansions, which is the image that I put here in this slide. But that can't be what we mean by preservation, because the definition of a community to me is really constant change. And some of that change you want. We didn't want to preserve the combat zone, which was placed in Chinatown deliberately in 1974 by zoning policy.
Oreos? Yeah, Oreos.
Yep. Please mute yourself. Thank you. But so it comes with the good and the bad. And some of the bad that's come from the change that's happened in Chinatown is a huge impact from the almost 3,000 or more than 3,000 luxury units that have been added through high-rise development in the Chinatown downtown area, increasing disparity. The white household's income today in Chinatown is more than 6 times the income of an Asian household. And about a third of the community still lives below the poverty line despite that gentrification. So that tells you a little bit about where Chinatown was, what has happened to it, and the fact that the addition of this new supposedly, economic development projects have not resulted in a better life, or advancement for the people who were there. But again, so the question is, what is it that we're trying to preserve? And is it buildings? So these are some of the 19th century row houses, the kind of small scale streetscapes, that used to be in Chinatown. You don't think of this when you think of Chinatown because this is the residential section that's below Neyland Street. People usually just think of the restaurants along Beach Street and the commercial section. But this is what Chinatown used to look like back in the day, very similar to Bay Village, which was protected. But whereas Chinatown was the target of urban renewal and slum clearance. So yes, we could save buildings, and we do want to save buildings. That's actually one of the focuses of our work currently. But you could save those buildings and no longer have a Chinatown. So that can't be the center or the only center. So is it green space? Sometimes when we think about preservation, we're thinking about natural preservation. And although there's very little green in Chinatown. But yes, so that's another area that we're working in. We're trying to bring back backyard and rooftop gardens where possible. We're trying to preserve a park, which is not green, it's all asphalt, but the Reggie Wong Memorial Park is very important to the community, both to the neighbors who live nearby and whose kids ride their tricycles around the lot, but also because it's the cultural, emotional home of Chinese 9-man volleyball, which is a very important sport that has a history rooted in Chinese exclusion and the history of Chinese laborers in this country that all, that came from this little village in southern China. Is it small businesses? The restaurants, the grocery stores, the bakeries, that's certainly what people think of when they think of Chinatown. Is it, but again, the businesses cannot survive alone. And one of the things we are working on is affordable commercial space and ways to think about social justice investment in businesses. That's in our plans. We're not really there yet, but is it street signs? Is it pagodas? Is it symbols or the Chinatown gate, or the fact that signs are in Chinese? So this is a picture of DC Chinatown. And Washington, DC Chinatown is the Chinatown that we always point to when we say we do not want to end up like DC Chinatown. Because this is the Chinatown. I mean, look at how beautiful that gate is. So if preservation's about the gate, they've got it, but there are like almost no Chinese there. And you have Walgreens, you have Starbucks, you have every chain you can think of, but they have Chinese signs because it's mandated by the city. That was one of the ways that they thought they would be preserving Chinatown, was to mandate that there would be Chinese language signs on all of the businesses. But if the businesses only cater to tourists, is that still Chinatown? And it really, all of this really begs the question of, can you have a Chinatown if you don't have Chinese people there? So Boston Chinatown is a neighborhood and a regional cultural center whose history is rooted in generations of working class immigrant families struggling against racial exclusion and violence for a better life. And it survived since the early 1800s. And really anchored the generations, that working class core. But today, Chinatown struggles with gentrification, displacement, climate change, economic insecurity. So again, it makes us wonder, what are we preserving and what are we changing for a better, more just future? And I think, when I think about it, I think of Chinatown's legacy is one of fierce determination and resilience. That people, despite legal exclusion from this country, despite mob anti-Chinese violence, they came together, they banded together, they protected their space, and they kept it all this time in order to be able to make a life here. And in a way, this is a picture of my mother, because when I think about fierce determination and resilience, that's how I think of my mother. And that's probably the one trait that I inherited from my mother. My mother passed a few years ago, but she was struggling with advanced dementia. And she passed her last days at the Hebrew Rehabilitation Center in the memory care unit, where everybody is struggling with advanced dementia. And I would go there and I would just help her eat because she was becoming unable to eat on her own. She was starting to have difficulty chewing. And yet, look at her. She had that determination and that resilient attitude that every day was a new day and she was going to figure out something that was meaningful to her. And so I think about that, and I think about how, for me as her daughter, going to feed her lunch or taking her off her floor in a wheelchair, those were just like little things, but they made a difference. And those many different discrete and achievable actions can contribute to preserving that intangible spirit. And so that's how I think about preserving Chinatown as well. And a community land trust is particularly well suited for this task, because what a community land trust is about is acquiring land and keeping it for the community and keeping it for community priorities, ensuring permanent affordability, whether we're talking about housing or commercial space, through 99-year ground leases that the community holds, and implementing a wide variety of development priorities that, again, are determined through a community governance process. So it's a very flexible tool. And because of that, it's very well suited for thinking about these questions of preservation, resilience, development, affordability. Oops, uh-oh. My bad. So this is a little logo that we have to show what our model is about. First, that we work to, to address issues of displacement and destabilization, and we engage the community in determining and shaping the place that we call home. We stabilize through increasing community control of land and through permanent affordability. And we steward shared resources together for a thriving community. So our work, we currently list them as 4 pillars of action. First, permanent affordability. The second is preserving our history and culture in tangible ways. The third is resilience and sustainability in relationship to the environment. And the fourth is growing equity for racial equity. And we're talking about financial equity. So permanently affordable ownership. Initially, our first project was acquiring a couple of row houses and turning them into permanently affordable home ownership units on a 99-year ground lease. And this was our first row house. The woman who's standing right next to me, she and her family of 4 were the first buyers, and previously she and her family were living in a 3-bedroom apartment, renting that apartment with 2 other families and her mother-in-law. And so she was very glad. She told me she didn't want to live with her mother-in-law anymore, and she was very glad to be in a stable place where she didn't have to worry about being evicted. I think that, you know, when, and again, we think about the permanent affordability in terms of addressing the displacement and gentrification, but it's also very important because, right, when we talk about housing in the public conversation, people always talk about developing new affordable housing. And I'm all for developing new affordable housing. There is a need for more supply. But what people don't talk about enough is, what about keeping people in the homes they're already living in? So there's a need to have more conversation about preservation of housing. And preservation of housing makes sense on so many levels. It's both because that is a way to prevent displacement before it happens. It's actually environmentally more sustainable for us to save and preserve buildings instead of always demolishing and rebuilding. And it's also about, it's in fact, usually less expensive and quicker to preserve an existing building as affordable housing as opposed to starting with a new construction. So I'm not against new construction, but preservation of housing is just such an important piece to be in the public conversation today. And it's linked with preservation, resilience, all these different lanes of conversation. We talk about historic and cultural preservation. And again, there are many different aspects to that work. There is the preservation of the row house buildings and the small scale streets that we talked about. And in addition to project by project acquisition and preservation, we're working on policies that will help us to somewhat affect the extreme level of speculation that we've seen in Chinatown. We were, a lot of these row houses in the last 8 years were emptied out. Tenants were evicted because buyers were coming in to turn them into full-time short-term rentals, Airbnb type units. We were able to band together with many other neighborhoods and organizations and passed Boston's short-term rental ordinance, which then made this type of investor-driven full-time short-term rental activity illegal. We're now looking at other questions such as the zoning that governs these, particularly a few very small intact row house streets, because Chinatown was not recognized as a residential neighborhood from the 1800s when it began until 1990. Therefore, it doesn't have some of the zoning guidelines that other neighborhoods have, such as a row house district, which would normally have somewhat smaller scale height and massing guidelines than the other streets. So that's we see that as an issue of addressing inequity, that we want to change that and create a row house protection area. We want to give more definition to within the zoning code. What are we protecting? What does it mean? Is it just about the dimensions? Or is there some way to actually characterize that which is important to a neighborhood and should be protected? There's also a number of cultural placekeeping and public arts projects that we think are part of that preservation message and framework as well. One of the things we're doing is creating an immigrant history trail, which will be a multimedia trail where people go and can discover old archival photographs, hear stories, call a phone number, hear a story, scan a QR code, see a website, but also have a physical marker on these different sites throughout Chinatown. We're working with an artist on a project called Chinatown Worker Statues, in which we will have 4 permanent bronze statues of a restaurant worker, a laundry worker, a grandmother caretaker, and restaurant laundry taker. I'm blanking on the 4th one, but the idea is that we have so many statues of generals and people like that, but what about statues of the ordinary workers who really built the city? And that also in particular for Chinese Americans, to recognize that Chinese Americans have been part of the history of the city, are not just newcomers, as we're always perceived. Chinatown is actually it's the hottest neighborhood in the city, the worst heat island. It's also threatened by flooding potentially as early as 2030 in the event of a major storm. And it has the worst air quality in the state because it's at the intersection of 2 highways. So all of these different issues have affected Chinatown and left it environmentally vulnerable as well. One of the projects that we're working on is a community-led microgrid. This would increase resilience and community power, but while at the same time reducing carbon emissions and reducing energy costs. And finally, the 4th pillar is finding ways for people to finding and developing financial tools for people to invest in racial equity. We have created a row house preservation fund, which is made up of private capital to provide us with more flexibility in taking homes off of the market. But we're also in the process of developing other community investment alternatives so that instead of investment being all about speculation and destabilizing communities, that people can actually invest in stable communities instead. So some of these things may seem a little bit far-fetched or idealistic, but I think that it's because if it seems that they don't make sense, it's because what's our standard? Our standard is an unjust system. That's really organized around extractive capital as the center of decision-making. So I think if instead we can free our minds to think about the principles of preservation, resilience, and really centering justice, then that liberates us to really think about a different vision and the community that we're striving for that can make some of these projects actually possible. So I'm just going to end there, and I'd like to have more conversation with people.
Is there any questions either on Zoom or in person? You can take them. If there are other questions, question. Okay, anyone? Yes.
How exactly does the 100-year or 99-year lease work? Is it a lease or is it actually more like a mortgage? Like how does that work exactly?
So the question is, how exactly does a 99-year lease work? It is a lease, not a mortgage, although, for instance, the city of Boston may provide loans. Often they're forgivable loans or deferred loans, which will contain affordability requirements that are connected to the financing. But in our case, the ground lease means that we own the land, we lease the land to the building owner, and the lease includes requirements that it remain affordable and a certain resale formula. So that will allow for some appreciation, but not a speculative level of appreciation. Yeah.
Question about what you're thinking about preserving existing houses. So I want to understand, are you proposing that population disappears in existing houses, or each owner and own existing house at the leisure and affordability? I'm trying to understand what do you mean by preserving existing houses?
Oh, I wasn't suggesting, so the question, I think the question was, can you clarify what you mean about preserving existing housing? Are you suggesting that your organization or some institution would actually interfere with the owners to make them preserve certain things? So I think what I was primarily talking about was preserving I think what I was primarily talking about was preserving existing housing, because a lot of housing today is being snapped up by investors whose goal is to buy these homes, flip them for a big profit, or turn them into luxury condos. In general, when the investor buyers come in, and they usually come in with cash, and so that nobody else, who wants it as actually a home is able to buy. It's all about money. It's all about profit and squeezing as much profit out as possible. So what I'm suggesting, and usually in the process of property turnover, all of the tenants get evicted. The city of Boston, is heavily renter. Chinatown's 91% renters. But what I think that with an emphasis on preservation, we can have policies, financing programs from government, support for nonprofits like ours that actually encourages and makes it possible for us to buy those homes and preserve them as affordable housing instead of just letting the market do whatever it will. Because the market does whatever it will, partly because we've set up a system that allows the market and allows those speculators to act like that. So for instance, we have proposed policies like a tenant opportunity to purchase. If an owner of a multifamily building is going to sell, why not give that first option to the tenants? And then the tenants can have the option of partnering with a nonprofit or a developer that can work with them. If they don't have that capacity. So there's things like that. I'm not necessarily talking about coming in and taking somebody's property. There are certain things in terms of that would interfere with individual property owners, such as, if zoning guidelines are changed. But I think some of those, that already exists. It's just a matter of what are the zoning guidelines that that you want in a certain neighborhood.
Thank you for speaking with us this evening. My question is, if I read your slide correctly, there are 11,000 Chinese living in Chinatown. Is that correct?
There are 11,000 Chinatown residents, about 48% are Asian.
And of the 48% that are Chinese, are they newly arrived? Are they first generation, second generation? Is that a statistic
I don't-
you might know?
I don't know those statistics offhand, but I know that it is a heavily immigrant first generation community, but there are also people who are born here, like myself. I don't live in Chinatown, but there are people who are like myself. And a pretty wide range of new immigrants and people who've been here for decades. For a long time, people used to say that Chinatown was a transient neighborhood because it was mostly renters, and it always bugged me because it's not a transient neighborhood. In fact, Chinatown tenants, I think, live in place longer than tenants in across the city on the average. And that's partly because partly due to the legacy of urban renewal, that there was replacement housing built when housing was raised, but there have been a number of large subsidized developments in Chinatown for many decades. And once families are in certain developments like Taitong Village, Mass Pike Towers, they never leave because those are good, stable homes.
Do children stay, children of immigrants stay, or do they move to other neighborhoods around into the suburbs?
I think both.
Okay.
Yeah, and we're actually seeing more of a situation as there have been a small number of home ownership units in Chinatown, both developed by the Community Development Corporation recently, and the small number of units that we preserved and sold as condos, that there is a lot of interest from people also in not leaving the community when they're looking for housing that they otherwise wouldn't be able to afford, if their parents are still there, or there's an increased interest in people coming back to the community as well. But there's always people leaving for different reasons.
One more, do the Chinese and non-Chinese mix in Chinatown? I mean, socialize, interact?
It kind of depends. There are places, there are parts of the community and buildings in Chinatown where there's a lot of interaction, especially where people are living together in the same buildings. But I would say on the whole, Chinatown is a fairly segregated community, particularly with the new residents that have come in that are like very wealthy white residents, mostly some foreign students as well, living in the high rise, in the luxury high rises, really don't mix with the longer term residents much.
So we have our first question is from Angie. Hi Lydia, this is Angie, your old friend. How much support does the city and state provide for these projects?
So, hi Andy. The city has been very supportive and has something called the Acquisition Opportunity Program, which is specifically focused on buying properties to take them off the market for affordable housing. So that is somewhat unique. There's only a few cities that have programs like that, and we have been successful. They've been very supportive in with our first project. I mean, how much, it's really a project by project decision, and it's never enough. And so we've been advocating and pushing for more. And actually, because of that, in the last 2 years, last year, $20 million of ARPA funding was added to the Acquisition Opportunity Program, which was formerly in the $7 to $9 million range. And this year, the fiscal year 23 budget, there's $28 million in the Acquisition Opportunity Program. The state, I would say less so. We are actually actively working on with the Greater Boston Community Land Trust Network and community development corporations and others to advocate for a small property acquisition program or small property acquisition fund from the state. Because the state is largely focused on new construction and larger projects.
Next question is from Sarah Redmore. I'm curious about the Chinese immigrant population in Boston. Increasing, decreasing, or stable? Does that information affect this project?
The Chinese population is increasing. And it's both, you know, from birth rate as well as new immigration, continuous immigration. It's not necessarily increasing in Chinatown so much, although a little bit, you know, as the amount of affordable housing grows. We have been successful working with other community organizations in increasing that. But it's growing in other areas like Quincy, Malden. You know, if you look at, there are a lot of Chinese now in public housing projects in South Boston and Charlestown, Alston, Brighton.
The next question comes in. What are some of the main drivers or factors of gentrification of China in Boston?
So I think that the main driver is real estate speculation, unlimited real estate speculation. When we first started in 2015, we thought maybe we can buy a row house from a friendly family around 800,000 or 900,000, seemed like a reasonable market price at the time. The same row houses today, without any improvements, are in the $1.5 to $2 million range. And that's pure speculative activity. It's not because, there's been a lot of work done on these buildings. They're often dilapidated and still commanding those kinds of prices.
Okay, so we're going to take it back to the room. If there's anyone who got, I think this gentleman, I saw your hand raised the first time. We'll take it back to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask briefly on the passage of short-term lease ordinance. Can you sort of describe the process and the lesson learned or the challenge not along the way?
I think it was really the right thing for us to do because it clearly did make a difference. We saw the height of actually prices in Chinatown, they've gone down a little bit. It's like it went like this and then it kind of started leveling off, but it started leveling off because I think of the passage of the short-term rental ordinance. What was interesting about that was that the neighborhoods who are most focused on the legislation in Boston were all of the downtown neighborhoods. So we found ourselves, even though our focus has usually been in building coalitions with other communities of color, other, working class neighborhoods and low income neighborhoods like ours. But in this case, it was Bay Village, the Leather District, Beacon Hill. Those were the places that were also being hit by the short-term rental thing. And for some neighborhoods, their main concern was about the loud parties or other disturbances as opposed to the speculative activity and the taking housing out of the regular housing stock. But we found common ground and eventually also found common ground with hotel workers too, who were concerned about the loss of jobs from people not going to hotels.
Thank you.
In the Chinese culture, do elderly go to like this living or relationship place, or are they living in multi-generational situations? And does that affect how the is available if somebody ages in place?
I don't think there's any one model or any one pattern. That traditionally Chinese elders would age in place with their extended family. But I think coming to the US and the living conditions in the US are so different that that's not always the case. So I know elders who are living in elderly housing, independent elderly housing, assisted living. I know people who are living in their homes with their families. It really depends on people's situation. But I would say that there is a real need for more intergenerational housing. And there's also a real need for different approaches to elder housing. Because, and actually at one of the growing industries that employs a lot of Chinese workers is the home healthcare industry. So what I have been thinking about, though haven't been able to go there yet as an active project, is that why can't we have elder housing, which is combined with affordable housing for home healthcare workers? That would just make a lot of sense. And often the home healthcare workers, they tend to work by community and language group. So the Chinese home healthcare workers focus on caring for the Chinese elderly, and the Spanish-speaking home healthcare workers focus on the Spanish-speaking families, et cetera.
Here, Karen, do you wanna? No, one is good, because who's in here? All right, one more question. Hey. Please.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was thinking about what you were speaking about developers, and I was wondering if you had any suggestions on how maybe developers could do a better job if they do end up working with you, or if there's a way they can be more sympathetic, or should they just stick out of it? How they can work with you.
I think that developers can do good by really working with the community and really listening to what the community's priorities are. And I think there are some that really want to do that. I've actually seen some developers recently really go out of their way to understand what the needs are and think of creative ways to address them. But I think that we also need systems change in terms of how the whole development process moves forward. And of course, that's something that Mayor Wu has pledged to, but that's a process that's still unfolding. I think it's been a problem for so many years that developers kind of have their first conversations with the BPDA, and assumptions are made about development projects way before it goes to the community, so that the community process is usually tailing a process that has already happened between the city and the developer. And that's what's been so frustrating and angering to communities, because people feel like it's all a done deal. And when you have zoning that's routinely ignored and seen as just the starting point for negotiation, that also makes everybody feel like, what are we doing here? So I think that we're very interested in that process of planning and development being changed a little, so that planning actually means something, zoning actually means something, but that it's up to date and reflects real life and what the community wants, and then development can follow.
Very last question, sorry, Karen.
Thank you. Hi, Lydia. My name is Diana Cauldron. I'm a resident of Beacon Hill, and I'm in the Historic Preservation Grant Program. And thank you so much. I really enjoyed this talk. I had a question for you about how we can protect the small businesses. I feel the same way as you do about our small businesses in Beacon Hill and the rents increasing. And I'm curious about your feeling on the 2018 Wu at the time as a counselor, and she proposed an ordinance that unfortunately didn't get to vote, but had a lot of city councilors support a formula retail ordinance that would basically cause any chain store that would come into a street like Charles Street or a small street in Chinatown to go through a variance process to get approval to come in, so the neighborhood would have a say. And I'm just curious your thoughts on that. Do you think it's worthwhile pursuing that? I like the idea of a coalition and having different neighborhoods work together to support the small businesses.
Yeah, I actually was not that familiar with that ordinance proposal, but I would support something like that. That's the type of thing that we've been thinking about in terms of the zoning code. Is there something that we can put into our protection areas that's saying we're protecting a certain character and a certain small scale, cultural character, whatever, that would require additional process, so you don't just have a bunch of banks and Dunkin' Donuts everywhere.
All right, thank you.
So yes, Lydia, thank you so much. This was super, just like amazing presentation. I think you touched on what a lot of students are working on in their classes and their studios on their thesis projects. So yeah, this was great to have you here during our intensive week. So